Are you experiencing blossoms and backwash in your watercolor paintings? Is there something that you're doing that's contributing to this undesirable condition? In this short video tip, I'm going to review two of the major causes of blossoms and backwash. I've set up this simple exercise on a quarter sheet of watercolor paper to demonstrate two situations that can result in unwanted blossoms and backwash. I've divided this into 6 blocks, 3 large, 3 small, and at first I'll be working in the top 3 blocks. You'll notice that I've labeled these blocks saturated, damp, and dry, moving from left to right. I'm going to put a fairly dark value wash in each of those top 3 blocks. And then I'm going to come back with a brush fully loaded and introduce that into each of the boxes that have the wash down. Then I'm going to come back with a damp brush, and then I'm going to come back with a low moisture brush. And the labeling refers to the condition of the paper at the point that I'm going to introduce the brush to the paper. So at the very first box, the loaded brush will be introduced to that block when the paper is saturated. Same with the damp brush, same with the low moisture brush. The second block, those brushes will be introduced when the paper is damp, and on the last box, that will be accomplished while the paper is dry. I've mixed a fairly dark mixture of royal blue on my palette, and now I'm going to apply a wash to the box that is labeled dry. So I'm applying a flat wash to this box, and I'm just loading up my brush. You can see I have a nice bead there. And I'm just going to bring that down the page in that box, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to dry this thoroughly with a hairdryer. So I have the box completely filled with this dark valued wash. Now I've dried that box with a hairdryer. So the box on the right is completely dry, and now I'm coming in on the middle box that's labeled damp. So again, I'm going to put a flat wash over the entire area of this box. And after this is full, I've got the whole area, have the wash over the whole area. I want to pick up any excess there, but I want it to be even. So now I'm going to let that start to air dry. I'm not going to dry it with a hairdryer. Now I'm going to put a wash over the third box, which is labeled saturated. So I have a dry box and a damp box because the box in the middle I've been letting air dry. So it's still damp, while the box on the far right I dry with a hairdryer. So once I put the wash over this entire area, what I'll be left with are 3 boxes with different conditions of moisture content in the paper. And then once I've completed this box, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a 1/2 inch flat brush, I'm going to fully load it, and then I'm going to introduce that brush to the paper in each one of these boxes. And remember, each one of these have 3 different levels of moisture content. So here I've got a loaded brush, I'm going across the saturated box, and I'm going across the damp box, and now I'm going across the dry box with a saturated brush. So if you look what's happening on the left, you can see that the paint that I've added to that box is starting to run and starting to flow into the wash that was already there. And I came in with a pretty clear mixture, so it's much lighter. If I had come in with a darker mixture, it would have integrated a little differently, but I want you to be able to see where the water coming off the brush is going. Now, while I still have the 3 levels of moisture in my paper, I'm coming back with a damp brush, and I'm taking the excess moisture I picked up from the saturated area off, but I'm using a damp brush across these three levels of moisture. So I have a saturated paper, damp paper, and dry paper once again. And now my brush is fairly dry. It's a very low moisture brush, so it doesn't have a lot of moisture in it or paint. And I'm going across the three different moisture conditions. A little too much in it. You can see the texture that'll be created if you have a low moisture brush. Now I'm going to dry this with a hair dryer and we'll take a look at the result. So now the paper is thoroughly dry. If we look at the first block, the paper was saturated and the brush was saturated. They had equal levels of moisture. So when I touched the brush to the paper, it was absorbed into the flow of the existing wash. Now let's take a look at the damp paper. Here we have a different result. We actually have a blossom. And what causes that is the fully loaded brush had more moisture than what was in the paper. The paper in this block was only damp, so it had already started to dry. So what happened is when that water left the brush and flowed onto the paper, it started to push pigment around, and other areas are dry, and it starts to create hard-edged blossoms. That difference in moisture level between your brush and your paper results in this blossom, because what's happening is you're introducing a fluid mixture into this damp paper, which has already started to dry. So the paint isn't set yet, but and it can be pushed around. The pigment in it can be pushed around, and when you introduce that water, it starts to flow and it starts to move that pigment, and it pushes it up into edges, causing these blossoms. Next, I'll move over to the dry block. The dry block here, the paint is already set, so the brush has more moisture than the paper. However, when it's dry, the pigment's set, and you're not going to create backwashes. You can lift. It takes some agitation to do that, but you can see that that brush stroke with a saturated brush, it just put a glaze over top of it with a crisp edge, and it didn't create any of the backwash condition because the pigment is set. And if I move on to a damp brush and a low moisture brush, there's no issues because there's less moisture in the brush than on the paper, and it's not going to push the paint around and cause a backwash. So the real issue is with the damp paper. In particular, when I have a fully loaded saturated brush with a damp paper combination, that's a dangerous place to be because the chances are that that flow of the paint off your brush is going to push the pigment around, and it's going to cause you some blossoms. If your paper has already started to dry and it's no longer saturated and it's somewhere in between saturated and dry, you're best just letting it dry rather than take a fully loaded brush to it, because you're probably going to end up with blossoms. Next, in the lower left hand box, I'm going to demonstrate the other situation which will cause actually backwashes. So I'm bringing down a wash to fill this whole block, and you can see I have a bead of paint as I bring that down. So I'm going to load my brush up. So my brush is fully loaded. I'm bringing this down. I'm going to take it all the way to the bottom, and you'll see that I have excess paint. So I've covered the paper and the paint's flowed down, and now I have a bead of water there at the bottom. So what I'm going to do is let this start to dry. That paper at the top is going to dry before the bottom, and it's going to start to pull that moisture up just like a paper towel, and that's going to cause backwash condition. So while that box on the left is drying, I'm just going to recreate the situation that we had in the top box. In this case, I'm going to put this wash on this square, and I'm going to let it dry a little bit so that it's damp. So right now it's saturated. I'm going to remove the excess bead at the bottom by touching it with a damp brush. So that'll pick up the excess moisture, and it's going to flow down. I'll cover that up though. So I'm going to let that start to dry, And when it's in a damp condition, I'm going to come back with clear water and I'll drop it in there, and it'll just be another illustration of what's happening that happened at the very top of the damp box. Now I'm going to go back to that box on the left, and you can see now that I still have that bead. It started to dry at the top, and you can see that moisture is starting to be pulled up into the dry paper, just like you would see in a paper towel. Because I left excess paint there at the bottom, a lot of moisture, I have an imbalance of moisture now in that block. So the dry paper is going to wick that moisture from the area that has that bead right up into it. Now I'm going to move to the center block, which is now damp. And what I'm going to do is recreate what happened at the top of the page when I put a loaded brush into damp paper. So I have clear water on this brush, so it's fully loaded. So you can see that water is starting to push the pigment around and it's causing a blossom. Now I'm going to take some of that moisture off the brush, and I'm just touching a damp brush to damp paper. And you can see really what I get is some lifting because it's such a dark value. But I don't get the backwash condition because I have a balance in moisture. You can see now I have both situations, a blossom and a backwash. The backwash in the left box and the blossom in the right box. Now I'm going to put a wash on the far right box here on the bottom, and I'm going to dry it completely. I've dried this box completely with a hairdryer. And now I'm going to take my fully loaded brush with clear water, and I'm going to touch it to this dry paper, this dry wash. And you can see what happens is it just pretty much stays there in a bead, because the dry paper will resist the flow of the moisture until I put so much in there that it starts to run down the page because I'm working at an angle. But you can see that I don't get the same condition that I got on the left where the paper was damp and started moving pigment around. What will happen here is if I were to lift this moisture off now, there's going to be some lifting of the pigment, but it's not going to cause a backwash. If you look at the three conditions on the bottom, I have the backwash on the left. You can see where that pulled that moisture up. Then in the middle, I have a blossom. You can see where that flow of the paint pushed the pigment around. It wasn't set, and it created a blossom. And here on the right box, you can see that I didn't get any blossoms or backwash. This is the finished exercise. Hopefully it's been helpful explaining what can contribute to causing blossoms and backwashes.